who's been following this program for any extended length of time knows that my primary background has been covering the Florida Gators. I would argue they probably are my number one team in a very unbiased way. So I figured, given the amount of success they had this year, I feel like it's now the time is to really unravel what Florida has done this year and how much success they are having in the recruiting front, particularly within the state of Florida, which is something that opposite to Lincoln Riley is not doing. So it's kind of fun being able to talk about the juxtaposition between what USC is doing and their lack of recruiting in the state of California versus the success that Florida is having with, obviously the downfall of Florida State, UCF, South Florida. Obviously, they won the Hawaii Bowl. Shout out to them, but they're just not playing in the same sort of ballpark that the Florida Gators are. But when I first did covered Florida back in August, and I was saying to myself, what would the expectation be for them this year? I went as far to sat there and said, hey, if they went 5-7, that would earn another season in my book. If they went 5-7 or 6-6 and showed some sign of life in terms of not completely getting spanked every week, actually showing some heart, showing some determination, Billy Napier is probably going to get another season. Because obviously the big question is Florida would have to sit there, and if they did fire Billy Napier, the question was who's the slam dunk hire that they're going to go after. Not to mention you would have had to pay Billy Napier about $30 million to get rid of him too. So that was kind of the two-way street. And even when they were struggling at the beginning of the season, I always go back and think of the Texas A&M game where Texas A&M decided to run a 99-yard drive and do nothing but run the ball every single play. And that was the game, at least in my head, where I sat there and said, man, that could be Billy Napier's final game. If they fired him right on the spot, if Scott Strickland said, hey, we're done with him, I don't think there would have been, I don't think you would have more people probably being ecstatic and doing backflips, and all of Gainesville would have been ecstatic. Whereas they decided to do the right thing and say, you know what, we're going to be patient about this. We're not going to jump the gun. And the one thing that I think Billy Napier doesn't get enough credit for is no matter what situation they've been in, no matter what they've done, I love that his message has always been the same. And his message has generally been, hey, we're going to focus on building through recruiting. We are going to be doing this through a very specific process in the sense of it's going to be happening with my fingerprints all over it. And is that going to take some time and piss some people off? Absolutely. But if you hired me to bring it to do this, it needs to be done with a very specific game plan, and it has to be done the way that I want to do it. And that goes through whether it's game planning, whether it's recruiting, whether it's talent evaluations. That's all kind of been together too. And not to mention too, he brought a lot of guys over from Louisiana too. I mean, you think of Montrell Johnson, who I think we're going to miss a lot this year, but I think Jaden Bowe has kind of been the unsung hero of this offensive team, and I think somebody who's going to make a really large presence going into this next season too. And even when you look at this early signing day back on December 4th too, I mean, they signed a number of different commits. I mean, you look at receiver Vernell Brown III, you think of Ben Hanks Jr., both positions that I think I would argue are probably the two biggest weaknesses on the team. I think wide receiver is definitely a big question they have to address. I mean, Vernell Brown is definitely a big addition, but also the 5-star receiver in Dallas Wilson, I think, is the big blue chip guy that being able to flip him from Dan Lanning's Oregon to Florida, who's ranked number 2 in the state, is such an incredible move. And it's just so fascinating to watch the difference between the shit show and pessimistic attitude that Florida Gator fans, including myself, had in August, beginning of September, let's just even say early October, to being able to turn this around and just be able to say to yourself, hey, we have an eight win season, and not to mention we beat LSU, Ole Miss, and Florida State. I would have been ecstatic with just that alone. But when you sit there and say to yourself the amount of optimism that's going into this, I mean, you have so many kids that are now wanting to come and play. I love that we're focusing on the state of Florida. And I know that sounds kind of silly in the sense of, well, no shit, you're a state school. Of course, you're not a state school, but of course you're the University of Florida. You're going to focus on the state of Florida. But you'd be surprised how many different programs in the country don't focus on in-state recruiting as much as you would think, right? But at the same time, another thing that Florida has done, I've talked about the recruiting aspect and how successful they've been, particularly within the state of Florida, which I think is going to be one of the keys to their success moving forward. But also just being really smart about in terms of what talents they're bringing in. Obviously, it was announced a couple weeks ago that co-defense coordinator Austin Armstrong would be leaving for Houston. But if you watch the bowl game versus Tulane, which was a really strong appearance for everybody involved, and it definitely instills another sense of confidence too. And just for everyone out there, bowl games still do matter, just in a slightly different way than they used to. But when you look at this Florida team now, I think the one thing that was very obvious is that Billy Napier has always been very smart about being able to scout talent, recruit talent, and be able to amass talent. I mean, you got a potentially generational quarterback now with DJ Lagway. And when you had Graham Mertz there, it was great because you had the 5-year senior there who DJ Lagway can learn behind. And now that he got hurt, you kind of had to throw DJ Lagway into the fire, but he has done a phenomenal job at really kind of running with it as best as he can. You can instantly tell overnight in terms of just some of those different throws that he makes are just things that you can't necessarily coach. These are just intangibles that are going to be exemplified throughout him just as a player. And when sometimes protections break up and when you have things that break down, sometimes you just have to be that sort of leader and that guy in order to really make a difference. And DJ Lagway is going to be that guy. And when you have more weapons now, such as Dallas Wilson, who's going to be coming in, I mean, I think tight end room, you're going to have to build on that a little bit more. But in general, you got to be excited. They're bringing in the right kids on campus. They look like that they're building a lot more depth than they have in years past. I think that's one of the valid criticisms that Florida had last season was the amount of depth that they had was definitely not on display as much. I think to some extent when those injuries certainly piled up, particularly in the secondary and to some extent on the defensive line, it really showed up and made a monumental impact on how this team really performed. But when you got through all of it and you go through all the ups and downs and hills and valleys, you say to yourself, man, Florida is in a really good spot and definitely on the verge of something great. Now you sit there and say to yourself, man, they're still going to have a brutal schedule for obviously in 2024 they did. 2025 it's going to be maybe even worse depending on how the transfer portal ends up shaking up and exactly how all these rosters kind of come together. But the good news is you do have some of your general nucleus of younger talent still there. You have the blue chip guy like DJ Lagway. You have Jaden Bowe, who I think is going to be your number one running back. He's shown that he is crafty and shifty and really good at yards after catch. He's going to be a guy that they're going to have to lean on a lot more going into next season. You have Ron Roberts, who they brought in from Auburn. He's going to be the guy now really calling the shots too. I think it was kind of it was directly implied. I think it was implied that Ron Roberts was calling the plays and Austin Armstrong kind of had his foot on things. But now that he is going off to Houston, to me, it's a lot more evident than Ron Roberts is calling the plays, and he probably was the entire time. So be able to have him, be able to see that transformation over the course of the season. It went from being a total liability, like I talked about at the very beginning of the season, such as that Texas A&M game and the ass whooping that they took versus Miami, to now being hopefully one of the strengths of the program. I mean, you talk about when they were the Swamp Kings, as I'm referencing the Netflix documentary. Those little examples, time over time, are going to be the difference between talking about Florida as just a talk about them as a 5 to 7 or 8 win team, to the difference between talking about in the college football playoff and actually being ranked and making some noise. These little changes over time are going to be the difference. But in terms of my opinion of where they go from here, I think they have every ability to be able to do something great and to be optimistic and positive and everything. But the reality is they're going to go as far as Billy Napier's play calling has taken them. I, for one, and I'm sure many fans in Gainesville would have to agree, but I think Florida is desperate for an offensive coordinator. I think Billy Napier would be much better off as sort of S the CEO type of guy where he's sort of overseeing things and making sure that his vision is being reflected over everywhere in the program, but like he said he has. But I would love it if he took a little bit of a step back in terms of not calling plays, because I think there's been, at least in my opinion, some question marks in terms of situational awareness, in terms of clock management, just sort of those differences that's the difference between winning a conference championship versus losing the game to get in, or it's the difference between winning by 3 points versus going home with a loss. It's those sort of examples that you sit there and say to yourself, I'd be a little bit concerned about it. But when you sit there and say to yourself, hey, they've restructured the offense to the point where they're going to be a lot more respectable this year. They have the young chip guys to get in there. It seems like the offensive line is still a work in progress, but they're heading in the right direction. And Ron Roberts has this defense flying everywhere. And I think you've seen just such a massive improvement over the course of the season that for now, it's not going to be as much of a question mark anymore. I think they got the necessary pieces there, particularly on the secondary. You have to sit there and say to yourself, they're going to go as far as Billy Napier's play calling goes. Now, obviously, the run game is going to have to get going a lot more than it did last year. I mean, I've been calling for that over and over again. Montreal Johnson is one hell of a talent. Jaden Bowe is too. So I'm excited to see where this goes.